Whether you're conquering professional exams or personal milestones, we welcome you to Beyond Clean's Confidence Certification, the 52-week test prep podcast series. With expert insights, actionable tips, and engaging discussions, we'll break down the toughest concepts in sterile processing and build your confidence every step of the way. Join host Sarah B. Cruz as she embarks on a mission to help you not just prep for tests, but craft your success story. And now your host, Sarah B. Cruz.
Hello and welcome. You're listening to Confidence Certification, a 52-week test prep podcast series to equip you to take your sterile processing career to the next level. I am your host, Sarah B. Cruz, and on this episode, we are going to be talking about, listening while you work. So if you are listening to this podcast in your workplace, awesome. And if you haven't started yet, why not? Wouldn't it be awesome if you just turned on a podcast like Confidence Certification and maybe you got some CEs for it? Definitely trending in that direction for this type of series, but Beyond Clean has tons of episodes that are available that are CE certified. And don't forget to get your articles on the go, which are also audible version of written articles that are also CE approved. So we have tons of opportunities for you to get your CEs in a passive learning type of way, but with active listening. See, so that's what the great thing about audible listening and learning. And before I get too carried away, I am so excited to introduce our guest today who probably knows a little bit more about it than I do. I think you guys will be able to tell by the end of the episode, Mr. Justin Poulin. Hey, Justin.
Hey, Sarah. By the way, as somebody who's done probably 3,000 podcasts, you are killing it.
Hey.
That's great. Your energy is awesome. The way you open the show, I'm just going to give you some real positive feedback. You are a great podcast host. So little role reversal. All of a sudden, I'm the guest. This is going to be an interesting change of pace for me.
Oh, I know. And good thing we aren't on video, though, unlike the articles on the go because I am red right now. I am blushing because Justin's right. A million years ago. No, God, I'm not that old. But, a couple of years ago, I was actually interviewed on the Beyond Clean podcast when I was a second shift supervisor. And I talked about shift wars. And at that time, it was the first time that I ever had a public stage to voice my, voice and contribute to the hum of our industry in sterile processing. So, Beyond Clean's really great at giving people the platform to not only listen while they work, but to speak and contribute to the tone of our voice amongst the healthcare industry. So big shout out to Justin and Beyond Clean for that.
Well, I'll just add one of the things that makes podcasting uniquely different is something you just highlighted, which is you really had a chance to have a voice and share your thoughts and opinions and experiences in working, every day in sterile processing. In the past, in many cases, to be able to have that, you'd either have to start your own blog or you'd have to do a lot of research and preparation and put something together for a publication. And let's be honest, for somebody who is just kind of dabbling and really enjoys being part of the community instead of trying to be an authoritative voice or somebody who sort of has a commitment to write articles every month, there was really no place for that. And podcasting allows us to have lots of different voices, lots of different conversations, share lots of different experiences, and, let people dabble in that without having to make this big commitment of time and energy to do so.
Yeah. And, a lot of the times a phrase would be called lowering the entry threshold. And I want to make perfectly clear that while podcasting and being a guest on a multitude of podcasts and live streaming videos, although it may be easier to do so, that doesn't mean the quality of what you should be delivering, can be delivering, and need to be delivering should even waver to the lowest at all. It needs to make sure that it's even more so above the bar level, right, Justin?
Yeah, I'm not saying lower quality.
Right.
I'm saying less commitment because as you know, it's a lot different to be a podcast guest than it is to be somebody who is organizing, coordinating, and producing the podcast. And the same goes, you may have all of the references to AAMI guidelines and other industry organizations with best practices and recommendations. You can have that all right in front of you. And it's oftentimes a lot easier to share that information in the context of a conversation than it is to then take that and try to compile it into, some sort of an article or writing. And some people are just not good at that. And I'll tell you, just as a quick aside, that is something that Hank Balch is very good at. And I think anybody who's been reading his articles and, his social media posts for all of these years is pretty well aware he's a gifted writer. It comes naturally to him. I think what made us good partners is the reason I started podcasting was because I tried to blog as a pastime in the sports world. And I just found it very difficult to just craft all of that and get the content out as easily as it was for me to speak. So my preferred method of communication is to have a conversation. And so I was naturally inclined to be on a podcast where Hank has grown into the role and mastered it. But I think initially there was trepidation because he likes to be much more sort of thoughtful and put a lot of energy into crafting, that written work. And so it also just is, it's different methods of communicating your thoughts and ideas.
Well, it's also different learning styles. So, Justin, is it safe to say that your preferred style of learning is listening or auditory?
I'm going to say second. Number one. Yeah. Second favorite. Number one is actually doing. I think I realized at a young age that I was very much a tactile learner. The only thing that really got me through schooling, which I found very difficult, like solo reading, long chapters, dry material, and then, sitting down and doing, study questions. That, not that I didn't do the work. It was hard for me to do. I had to in college, I had to go sit in the library and really lock myself down. And I had to drink a lot of coffee to focus for that period of time, sitting still by myself. It just didn't match my learning style. So, sales was so great. Even as a nurse, I enjoyed the actual work, the hands-on, being active. That suited me well. But even when I moved into sales, it was even better because I was constantly engaging different people throughout the day and learning and being in the department. And so when I left nursing and did that, it was transformative for me in so many ways because I learned from discussion. So to an extent, I would say audible learning as it is part of actually having an experience where you immerse yourself in a project. And definitely I prefer to do that with others as part of a team.
And you brought up discussions and that being a part of communication, and that two-way discussion is actually speaking and then active listening. And active listening is a huge part of that auditory, audible learning style. A number of episodes back, we talked about how to engage in active listening as well as active learning. So if you haven't heard that episode, go ahead and put a pin in this. I think it's around episode 10 or 11. Go back. And I know you're binging the show anyway, so I know exactly what episode it is. You know what it is. But the main part of that is the discussion, the communication. We hear the benefits of the hands-on. Justin, what are some of the benefits of hearing others discuss a topic, and how can we learn from hearing? In your own experience, what are some benefits?
Well, a couple. One is the access to that information is a lot easier. So, a lot of times we have downtime either in our commute or maybe we're at the gym. Like there are all these settings where we're doing something with our hands. You would not be able to sit down and watch a webinar. You would not be able to, for all of the in-person type learning events or lectures, you're not going to be able to do that then. But what a great way to make use of your time where your ears are really not required in the activity. And yes, of course, you want to hear somebody beep if you're about to get in an accident, but I don't think a podcast really threatens that. And even at the gym, maybe you want to pause your podcast for a second and, hey, can I work in on this piece of equipment with you? But for large, in large part, you're really able to multitask, listen to that information. And for somebody like myself, who's a tactile learner, that fits me very well because in school, I would always, and I'm a horrible artist. I cannot draw. So when I say I doodled, I'm even using that term very loosely. I chicken scratched, but I always had my pencil moving because that was how I was able to maintain my state of active listening. Otherwise, I would tune out, zone out, and daydream, and I would not be able to stay focused on the lecture or what the teacher was trying to teach. I had to be doing something. I feel like for people that, need that kind of activity when they're trying to learn, podcast is perfect because you can be driving, you can be at the gym, you can be cooking your dinner, you can be putting sets together in sterile processing and still be able to do both. And I almost think I retain more information that way than I do in all those other settings.
Yeah. And as we discussed in that episode, active learning and active listening is the art of being engaged and enthralled in what you're learning or listening about. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the most earth-shattering things. Listen, the ST108 just came out and I know water quality is important, but I can't listen to water quality anymore. So that topic is very difficult for me to stay actively involved in, especially with all the conversation happening about it. But when you are actively listening, that doesn't mean you have to like the topic to be enthralled and engaged with it, right? So whether it's the pen or it's the doodling, or sometimes I'll listen and I'll write. I prefer to read and write. Those are my preferred learning styles. But, there's actually lots of tips and tricks. And when we come back after a word from our sponsor and our mid-session confidence boost, we're going to be giving you more actionable steps and ways that you can incorporate listening to passing that certification test. Be right back. It's time for our mid-episode confidence boost, where we focus on a key sterile processing test concept. Now, there's no guarantee these concepts will be on the test that you take, but they are key concepts to the workplace and are discussed in the literature. Today, we'll cover quality assurance. There should be a quality assurance process for the preparation of trays and devices. Any complaints or concerns from the user department should be followed up and feedback given in written or electronic evidence. To facilitate the tracking of quality issues, all similar trays should be numbered. For example, your major tray 1, 2, and 3, and so on and so forth, so that problems can be tracked to the specific tray or device. All baskets should have ID tags, and any that are missing need to be replaced. Some facilities have a quality assurance report form that end users, like the OR or different facilities throughout the healthcare facility, can complete to report their quality issues. Quality assurance forms can identify SPD education and training issues, such as soiled instruments and sets, incorrect instruments and sets, or even broken or damaged instruments. That's going to wrap this week's mid-session confidence boost. Good luck. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us after that break. What did you think of that confidence boost? Are you feeling good about the words we just went over? Don't forget, if you're looking to listen to a certain word or term or process inside of your studying, reach out to us at info@beyondclean.net. We want to make sure that these episodes are helping you pass that test with confidence. Now, as we come back, we're still hanging out with our work BFF, Justin Poulin here. And Justin, I got to know, how has hosting a podcast changed how we as people relay information to others? I have to know this.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's necessarily changed the way that we relay information. I think it has helped accentuate the effectiveness of how we relay information. So if you think about it, like before we had the written word, before, people were literate in being able to read and write, so much of our history, the things that we learned, they were all passed down from generation to generation through stories. And the art of storytelling, while it still exists in prose, it obviously can be done in a very unique way when you have access to audio at the touch of your fingers. Like if you even think about it, like think about the pace with which we can disseminate the information now. So look at social media and how that's changed the news cycle. It's happened much, much quicker. It used to be records, or even before that, it was 8-tracks, then it's records, then it's tapes. But with the advent of the internet, this information and the distribution of it has happened much quicker. What hasn't changed is the impact of storytelling. And I think so many times when you're trying to learn about a concept, and especially like a lot of people listening now, they're preparing for certification. So maybe their industry experience is kind of, shorter. Maybe they've only been working for, 6 to 9 months. We lack the experience to relate a lot of these concepts early in education. It's one of the things that makes traditional college education so difficult. Sometimes you have all these prerequisites, but you have no real world application of it. So it's hard to fit it into this paradigm. What I love about, podcasting in particular, but auditory learning in general, is that we can tell that story and share those experiences. And that helps, people take that information and paint a picture in their mind. And it also helps you retain that information and make it more practical and put it into practice. And so those are how I think this has accentuated or enhanced how we learn. I think we're just taking better advantage of it.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that you can take all this audible and auditory listening and this ability to relay knowledge, and you want to make sure, especially when you're learning, you're not suffering from that telephone effect. You say it to one person and then they say it to the next person. And by the time it gets to you, it makes you really wonder what type of information you're getting. So I really appreciate how far you took that back and how this has actually made it more effective and efficient, dare I say. Yeah.
Yeah. I've been told anytime you do a presentation, tell a story. There's nothing. And so presentations at events is also auditory. It's just not solely auditory. So if somebody's got a PowerPoint presentation and they've got a number of slides, you've been in the ones where the slides are bullet points and the speaker basically reads the bullet points and they feel like they've transferred the necessary information to you. What needs to happen, and all the good presenters know this, is that they then tell a story about that information. That's what connects you to the audience. It's what inspires them. It's not the information on the slides. And I found, early on, the slides were a nice little crutch and they helped me make sure that I I have ADHD. Mm-hmm. I can get distracted super easy. I can go off on long ranting tangents. I definitely can. So it was good to have a PowerPoint to sort of structure my flow and make sure I didn't divert too much. At the same time, I really didn't want to rely too much on the bullet points. And I also wanted to sort of summarize succinctly. Like, there's a lot of information on this slide. Here's what's important. Here's why it's important. And here's kind of the story behind it, or a personal story of how I relate to it. That's what makes it impactful. And so I would even say, like, we don't just learn in these auditory settings by receiving information. Sometimes you may be in Sarah or my role and you may be presenting auditorily, and you should always keep in mind that you want to be telling a story about the information, because that's how you make a true impact.
Justin, that almost sounds like a tool our listeners can put in their tool belt. And I can't encourage that more. While we do have a preferred learning style, the way that we magnify and really intensify that learning style's ability to help us is by coupling it with our second favorite, just like Justin talked about today. I thought for sure this would be the number one, but actually it was the number 2. And when you take those quizzes or when you listen to that episode, I'm sure that you all ascribe to 1, 2, or even 3. So that's actually a little tip you can use to help study and use this, is mixing the multiple styles together to create that cemented comprehension that we talk about. Another tool that you can add to the belt, and Justin, I think that you'll appreciate this one, is using a recorder. Me personally, when I'm about to write an article, I very much enjoy writing, but I have to make sure I have all my ideas out, or my limitations and attention issues will also allow me to not finish a 500 to 750 word article, right? So I'll brain dump everything into the recording, and then I'll listen back to it and I'll start writing, because that's how I learned. The teacher would speak usually at me, right? Because let's be honest, it's not usually engaging conversation in the classroom, right? So they'd speak at me, and then I'd furiously write with like my really pretty pen. And I'm pretty much doing the same thing with my recorder.
Yeah. And I would say there's lots of applications for that too. Not just even in learning, but like when I was still working in a sales capacity, I was working with a repair company. And one of the things I would have to do is gather inventory to be able to establish, repair frequencies and really map out, hey, this is how often we should come. This is how many repairs we should do. But the elusive thing was, especially, even with a tracking system, but especially at places without a tracking system, was how was I going to get an accurate inventory before the inventory started moving? And, once the inventory starts moving, that really can mess up, your inventory counts. And so to your point, that retention of information, I could take, and I would always use the recorder on my phone, and I would speak the name of the tray, hit pause, go to the next one, and speak them all into it. And then I would transpose it later. I was learning about the inventory in my customer's account, but I was using the advantage of recording audio to make it a quicker process and then do the administrative on the back end. So, that's a different type of learning, but I think that we can do tools like that or use tools like that to enhance. Like, it's just faster, to your point, to say something than it is to write something.
Oh, yeah, 100%. I feel like I have the fastest hands in all the West. Okay, so because of how much I have to write in order to remember.
I'll do a words per minute challenge with you.
Listen, you can type and I'll write. Bring it, Justin.
Okay, all right.
Because if I'm going to type, it's just going to be the index finger. Deep.
Yeah.
It'll be great. And as we near the end of our episode, I just want to make sure that we clarify how to make sure you have a great source in your listening. Listening while you work and listening for how you learn and making the own things that you listen to. Don't forget credibility checks. Okay. And, I'm not saying that they have to be in a library and you have to use a codex to find them just to prove that they're perfect or anything like that. But whatever you're listening to, let's make sure that the information coming out of it is credible and sound. Sort of like when we talked about the practice tests online. Remember, someone who made that test probably made it for themselves. And once they passed that test, they stopped updating those questions. So those questions may be outdated or they may even be wrong. So Justin, what are some other ways that we can tell we're listening to a quality podcast besides being on Beyond Clean, or even just making sure that we are creating recordings that will hold up? What's some tricks we can add there?
Well, I would just say, especially if you're creating content, you really need to fact check your references. And I think that goes for listeners too. There's some podcasts you can listen to for personal growth and the development that aren't really citing very important industry sort of guidelines, right? Like, I would encourage people, especially if podcasting is sort of your preferred method of learning auditorily, that you don't just listen to Beyond Clean or another sterile processing podcast or all of the sterile processing podcasts only. I would also make sure that you subscribe to podcasts outside of the industry and, continue to explore your other interests, because I think having a library of podcasts that gives you a variety is a great way to sort of maintain that regular listening. If you kind of get to a point where you're listening to the same content, you're going to start tuning out. So you got to challenge your brain. You've got to challenge the flexibility of your brain with the type of content that you're consuming. So I'll just say that to kind of go to the point of some podcasts, you don't need to worry so much about quality. They're meant to be thought provoking. They're meant to give you some ideas and you take a couple of things from them into your personal life, and that's fine. When you do start to listen to, and it would be the same thing if you went to see somebody present at a conference, right? When you go and listen to that information, if there's something that's new to you, fact check it. And that's, really that's the best way. I would say, obviously if the podcasts have continuing education credits that are approved, I mean, that definitely adds credibility. There's some sort of quality check there. Another thing is making sure that if you're listening to something that's more promotional in nature, which isn't a bad thing. I think learning about the products and services that are coming into our hospitals is important. But if you're listening to something that's promotional, make sure that you realize that it's promotional, that it is basically saying like, we are highlighting this product or service. That's great. I'm going to learn about it from the experts that created that product or service. So you got to remember and also qualify who's preparing this information for me. What's their role in the industry, and making sure that you kind of understand the intent and the purpose of the content that's being created there. So I think those are some things, maybe not qualifiers. There's really no regulatory guidelines controlling subject matter expertise in the industry. And so you do have to train yourself to have a discerning ear. You definitely also, one of the great things about podcasting and social media in general is that you can challenge that thinking. And I would welcome that. And, a lot of times somebody may be thinking that they're speaking correctly, but they missed a little bit of a nuance. And if they're a subject matter expert, that really cares about the quality of their content, they're not going to get upset when you challenge them or bring something else to the table. Look for people who are willing and able to be collaborative instead of always having to be the final authority on things. That's a good sign of somebody who's trying to control the narrative versus somebody who is trying to contribute to the progress of the industry.
And that is just so perfect, because I like to tell the professionals that I mentor in leadership that if your success is defined by whether or not you, quote, got someone in trouble that day because you had to talk to them about something they were doing, or you had to let them know something wasn't okay, or retrain them on something, then you do not have the indicators of success that you're looking for. Okay. Because applying that to this, someone who has to fact check needs to be open to it. A fact check should never hurt somebody's feelings. And listen, sometimes you can go and you'll fact check only to find out that they were right. Okay. And no one's going to know that they were right unless you go and tell them you were right. And no one's going to know that you even wanted to question them. It's not as big as a deal as some of us are making it to just go and do that. And it's like Justin said, it's highly encouraged.
And it's part of being, self-learner, like is one of the themes that you brought up during this discussion. Like that is self-learning to a T. I'm not sure, or I don't think that's right. I'm going to go verify it. And you can even draw that to, validation is what happens in the lab setting. Verification is how we make sure that what was done in the lab is repeatable in our departments. You're basically doing the same thing. You're not validating the information that you're hearing. You're verifying. And keep in mind too, the podcast could be 3-4 years ago. The presentation could be 3-4 years old. It might have been accurate for the time that it was created, but now there's been, maybe a new, AAMI standard that's, been a revision and it's been updated. And now all of a sudden that information isn't. So I'll also say it's not always about fact checking whether or not the person you're listening to is accurate. Is it current? Like that fact checking it's more than just debunking somebody who's pretending to know everything. It's also about making sure that it's still relevant to today's environment.
And speaking of relevant, Justin, you have brought such an awesome element to the confidence certification episode today. It was awesome having you on, talking about the power of listening and including it in our auditory learning. And I hope that our listeners are empowered by today's episode. But before we get out of here, don't forget you guys have homework. Okay. So if you all listen to a podcast, you're listening to this one, I want you to go ahead and build your podcast library like Justin suggested. I think it's important to have multidisciplinary podcasts. There's a lot of Amy videos available, AORN. Sterile processing is not just sterile processing. It's the operating room. It's nurses. It's anesthesia. It's even environmental and biomed. So go ahead and surf around in the podcast world and create that library.
I got one other tip for everybody out there. As you hone your active listening skills and you really are able to focus, some of the podcast apps, most of them nowadays, allow you to speed up the content a little bit. So if you get really thirsty for it, set it at 1.2 times or 1.3 times and slowly work your way up. If you're casually listening, that's one thing. But if you are trying to consume more information in a certain amount of time, there's nothing wrong with making it Alvin and the Chipmunks a little bit, if you can keep pace with processing what you're hearing during the podcast. So I'll throw that out there because not a lot of early podcast listeners are aware that they can do that, if they're really, especially if they're trying to get more technical information from audio.
All right, everyone, that's going to wrap this week's episode. Make sure you tune in to next week when we talk about the power of level setting before, during, and after our studying. See you all next week. Bye. And that's going to do it for this week's episode. For more sterile processing education and resources, make sure to visit beyondclean.net or follow Beyond Clean on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram. And don't forget to check out over 1,000 SPD-related videos at youtube.com/beyondclean. If you have any questions or comments for the show, you can reach out to info@beyondclean.net. Finally, make sure to download the Beyond Clean mobile app on the Apple and Android app stores so that you don't miss a future episode of any of the other awesome Beyond Clean podcasts. My name's Sarah B. Cruz, and you've been listening to Confidence Certification. Until next time, keep fighting dirty and pass that test with confidence.
The views and opinions expressed in this podcast series are of Sarah B. Cruz only and do not represent the companies she works for or collaborates with.